Good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Harkdietz, and I am the Deputy CEO for PATH. I'm excited to welcome you to our virtual series, PATH Presents at the Forefront. Our last episode was titled Her Journey Back Home, in recognition of Women's History Month. In that episode, we explored the unique barriers that women experiencing homelessness face and ways we can dismantle such barriers. In today's episode, we are going to focus on housing equity. PATH acknowledges that many inequities exist in our society and are institutionalized in policies and practices that disproportionately impact our most vulnerable communities. When it comes to housing, factors such as race, age, gender, sexual orientation, immigration status, religion, disability, just to name a few, can greatly impact one's ability to find safe, secure, and affordable places to call home. Inequity in housing can be observed when gentrification prices people out of their own communities, when communities report higher rates of negative health outcomes due to the presence of environmental toxins, or when communities are excluded from participating in the planning process due to language or access barriers. During today's conversation, we will be hearing from two city council members that are working to address historic and lingering inequities in their districts. First, I have the honor of interviewing Los Angeles City Council member for District 4, Nithyarahman. Then our CEO, Joel John Roberts, will be interviewing San Diego City Council member for District 9, Sean Elo-Rivera. So if you've been joining us for what's been almost a year now, you know that these At the Forefront episodes are so important to accomplish our mission, which is to end homelessness for individuals, families, and communities. And if you're new, we want to welcome you. At the Forefront's our way of educating people on the facts about homelessness, its causes, and advocating for solutions to actually end homelessness. So we've realized that we will always provide services. We're always going to help people find a home. But in order to end homelessness, we have to continue to work to change the system that is causing it. And right now, you are part of that system change. Today's episode title is A Home is a Right, Not a Privilege. And before we really dive into this conversation, we'd like to set the stage with a video. The video that helps highlight the pervasive issue of housing segregation. It was produced by Gene Demby of NPR in 2018. Housing segregation is in everything. But to understand the root of the issue, you have to look at the government-backed policies that created the housing disparities we see today. So this video explains how these policies came to be and what effect they've had on schools, on health, family wealth, and policing. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll get started.
While Martin Luther King stood for nonviolence, now what's Martin Luther King? A street. And I don't give a where you in America. If you're on Martin Luther King Boulevard, there's some violence going down.
That, of course, is Chris Rock's famous joke about streets named for Martin Luther King Jr., which tend to be in, let's say, distressed areas. And he's not wrong, because if you look at the way housing segregation works in America, you can see how things ended up this way. Once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. Okay, let's look at MLK Boulevard in Baltimore. I want to show you how to see housing segregation in schools, in health, in family wealth, in policing. But first, an explanatory comma. It's the 1930s in the wake of the Great Depression. FDR is president. He wants to bring economic relief to millions of Americans through a collection of federal programs and projects called the New Deal. One part of that New Deal was the National Housing Act of 1934, which introduced ideas like the 30-year mortgage and low fixed interest rates. So now you have all these lower income people who can afford homes. But how do you make sure they don't default on their new mortgages? Enter the Homeowners Loan Corporation. The HOLC created residential security maps, and these maps, they're where the term redlining comes from. Green meant best area, best people, aka businessmen. Blue meant good people, like white-collar families. Yellow meant a declining area with working-class families. And red meant detrimental influences, hazardous, like foreign-born people, low-class whites, and most significantly, Negroes. Again and again on these HOLC maps, one of the most consistent criteria for redline neighborhoods is the presence of Black and brown people. Let's be clear. Studies show that people who lived in redlined areas were not necessarily more likely to default on their mortgages, but redlining made it difficult, if not impossible, to buy or refinance. So landlords abandon their properties, city services become unreliable. In most places, crime increases. and property values drop. All of these conditions fester for 30 years as white people flee to the brand new suburbs popping up all over the country. Many of those suburbs institute rules called covenants that explicitly forbid selling homes to black people, and all of this was perfectly legal. Now it's 1968, and MLK is assassinated.
Good evening. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, 39
Apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot.
Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis.
In the aftermath, Congress passes the Fair Housing Act of 1968. It's a policy meant to encourage equal housing opportunities regardless of race or religion or national origin, and it offers protections for future homeowners and renters, but it does little to fix the damage already done. Over the next 50 years, the Fair Housing Act is rarely enforced. So you can still see housing segregation and its effects in Baltimore and often along any MLK Boulevard in any U.S. city, like its effects on wealth. So home ownership is the major way Americans create wealth, right? Well, discrimination in housing is the major reason that black families up and down the income scale have a tiny fraction of the family wealth that white families do, even white families with less education and lower incomes. For almost 30 years, 98% of FHA loans were handed out to white borrowers. Not only were black neighborhoods redlined, and not only was the Fair Housing Act selectively enforced, if at all, but it is still, today, much harder for a black person to get a mortgage or home loan than it is for a white person.
Families are fearful of speaking up about a basic human right that should be afforded to everyone in the world, but definitely in the richest country in the world.
And housing segregation in schools. The primary way that Americans pay for public schools is by paying property taxes. People who live in more valuable homes have better funded local schools, better paid teachers, better school facilities, and more resources. Here's the feedback loop. The better the schools in a neighborhood, the more those homes in that neighborhood are worth. And the higher the property values of those homes, the more money there is for schools, and so on and so on. And housing segregation in health. Because of urban planning that benefited those richer, whiter neighborhoods, people of color are more likely to live near industrial plants that spew toxic fumes. They're more likely to live far away from grocery stores with fresh food, and in places where the water isn't drinkable. They're more likely to live in neighborhoods with crumbling infrastructure and in homes with toxic paint.
When you're living with rats, roaches, and things like that, that's deplorable. You cannot have that kind of stuff with children running around in a building that may be full of lead.
And not coincidentally, people of color have higher incidences of certain cancers, asthma, and heart disease. And housing segregation in policing. Housing segregation means we are having vastly different experiences with crime and vastly different experiences with policing. Because our neighborhoods are so segregated, sometimes racial profiling can be camouflaged as spatial profiling, where living in certain areas can make you more likely to be stopped by the police. And it means that people have a lot of unnecessary contact with the criminal justice system just because of where they live.
The problem in our city, the police and the citizens are fighting. They keep targeting my brothers and sisters who don't really have nothing.
And that heavy, aggressive kind of policing that you see in black neighborhoods in particular makes people feel like they can't trust the police. And when people don't trust the police, crimes go unsolved, and people have to find other ways to keep themselves safe. But of course, it's not just Baltimore, because housing segregation and discrimination fundamentally shape the lives of people in nearly every major American city. It really is in everything.
This video just really highlights how much more we have to do. So once again, I'm glad you're all joining us today to be part of the solution. And next, I'm honored to introduce our first interview. Nithyarahman is a mother of 5-year-old twins, an urban planner, co-founder of the homeless services nonprofit SELA, former executive director of Time's Up Entertainment, and the current representative for LA's 4th Council District. She ran for office on a platform of delivering compassionate and effective services for people experiencing homelessness, building more affordable housing, and moving faster to meet our city's climate goals. And she won a historic victory, becoming the first challenger in 17 years to defeat a sitting city council member. So we're so happy to have you on today. For my first question, I'd like to ask, what is your personal connection to housing instability and homelessness?
Well, I've never experienced homelessness personally, but my family and I were immigrants to this country. I moved to America when I was 6 years old with my mom. My father was already here in America, and we moved a lot when I was young. We moved from obviously across countries, and then we moved in America a couple of different times. And I think for me, my early years in America, when we had very little family support here, we had one relative in a different part of the country, when we had very few networks, social networks of our own, when we had to move again and create those networks of support in new places, I think they gave me an insight into how precarious life can be when you don't have those networks of family and friend-based support. I think for me, that insight into that experience of my early years in America really did give me a sense of how easy it can be to have a period of disruption. If my father had fallen sick in those early years when he was our only income earner, how quickly we would have fallen into a situation where we would not have been able to stay in our home, where we would not have had the social networks to be able to support us if we needed a friend's home to crash in or another family for support. And I think it gave me greater awareness of how precarious life can be for so many families and so many individuals in America today. And I think I never lost that awareness in my work.
Thank you so much for that and sharing the personal experience that really is highlighted in the bio I gave you of just your passion for the issue. So I'm going to shift a little bit more now to the district. Can you share some of the ways people in your district, which is Council District 4 in LA, for those that are watching, experience housing inequity?
Yeah, the district I represent is an interesting one. It's one of the wealthier districts in the city of Los Angeles. I believe it's the third wealthiest district by average income or median income. It is also one of the least racially diverse districts, not very representative in that way of the racial diversity that Los Angeles as a whole has. It's almost 75% Caucasian, with smaller percentages of people of other backgrounds. And so in many ways, it's a district that doesn't represent in some sense what all of Los Angeles does. And in other ways, it does. We have incredibly wealthy neighborhoods in our district, some of the wealthiest in the entire city, including in the Hollywood Hills, in Hancock Park. And yet our district also has a huge number of the city's affordable housing units, our rent stabilized housing stock. And, those two poles, in a sense, of housing stock are both encompassed in this district. What was interesting, I think, about this past election is that despite the fact that we've had in this district a significant number of renters, and it is majority renters in this district, just like it is in the majority of Los Angeles, our elected representatives from this district in the past have really been selected for the most part by voters who have been single-family homeowners as opposed to renters. And this was the first election where many, many more people participated in this local election than before. And I think the issues that we talked about in the campaign, issues related to rising rents, issues related to eviction protections, issues related to tenant protections, such as preventing harassment, making sure people who are on the verge of eviction have access to a lawyer. Those kinds of issues really resonated for the new voters who turned out to vote in this election. Many of the younger voters who voted for the first time in a municipal election. And so I think in a way, what we saw in this past election, and I think this could be interesting for the promise of future elections in Los Angeles as well, which are now overlapping with our federal elections for the first time, is that tenants or renters, not homeowners, have the ability to have greater power at the ballot box, and in some ways to correct some of the inequities in our housing policies in Los Angeles that have deprioritized renters' rights, or that haven't put enough emphasis on making sure people who are in housing stay in housing, because policies at City Hall have often been really focused on those people who voted in local elections who have been primarily homeowners. So I think in this sense, even though this district is a microcosm of some of the inequities that make up all of Los Angeles, this past election and what it foretells for Los Angeles as a whole could be a shift in the priorities related to housing and affordable housing and tenants' rights in City Hall as well.
Yeah, I think you're definitely really highlighting what we saw as well as we were following just the election, as well as the people that we serve getting involved. I know that you are pursuing really a proactive homeless outreach services and drop-in center policy at LA City Council. And I wondered if you could tell us more about this and its potential impact on homelessness.
Well, I got into this issue. The path to running for office was a long one for me. It was not something I had thought about, really seriously till very shortly before I decided to run. But the path to getting here, the path to deciding to run actually came out of my experience of starting this nonprofit in my neighborhood with a group of my neighbors that was providing services for people who are experiencing homelessness. Over the last few years in Los Angeles, we've had rising homelessness in the city. We've had also a change in the way that homelessness has been spread throughout the city. For many years, the vast majority of people experiencing homelessness were just in a few neighborhoods, in Skid Row, some in Hollywood, and some at the beaches. But over the past few years, we've also seen that homelessness has risen across neighborhoods in the city, including in my own neighborhood. And so I had worked briefly at City Hall on the issue of homelessness. I had seen what I saw misallocations. I thought they were misallocations of our spending on homelessness at the city, which was really focused not on services and housing, but on putting people who are experiencing homelessness in jail, rather than on solutions that would actually end the condition of homelessness for them. And when I went back into my own neighborhood and saw an increasing number of people experiencing homelessness in my neighborhood, which is Silver Lake, and in my surrounding neighborhoods, I started to want to take action locally. And when I started to take that action, I also realized that in most parts of the city where people were experiencing homelessness, we had made it incredibly difficult for people to get access to the help and services that they needed. In this part of the city, for example, where I live and in the surrounding neighborhoods, before we started our work as volunteers, there was not a single place where people could walk in to a shelter bed. There was not a place where people could walk in and use the bathroom or take a shower where they were welcome to do that. There was not really a place where people could go and talk to a case manager. They had to wait for a case manager to come to them or an outreach worker to come to them. And those kind of services had not been built up in either the city or the county of Los Angeles at all. And so one of the things that I did through the nonprofit coalition was to try and bring those services and bring case managers and bring outreach workers to a part of the city that had been a resource desert for many years. In office, I think doing the same thing on a more expanded scale throughout the district is really one of the anchors of our policy towards homelessness, and something that I think is really important to make sure that people who are experiencing homelessness are building those relationships of trust with outreach workers and case managers through what can be a very long journey from living in an encampment or in a tent into a home, and to have the time to be able to make that journey.
Yeah, thank you so much for saying it so well. I mean, our system is so complex, and anything we can do to try to make access easier, I think, is a key priority. I know you work very closely with our office, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about your office's work with our Lease Up program, which is our landlord engagement program, and how this is one solution that you've invested in as a team.
Well, I want to talk about that long journey from experiencing homelessness into a home and why that is so long. One of the biggest factors in that is that we simply do not have the housing in Los Angeles to transition people out of homelessness. Even though now in our district, we now have more regular outreach happening at encampments, the very sad reality of that outreach is that oftentimes outreach workers are going out with nothing more than an offer of a connection to services, but no housing options for people to move into. In Los Angeles, the city has invested in things like Prop HHH, which have been trying to increase the number of permanent supportive housing units available to people. The city has been pushing on building more affordable housing, on buying units through programs that are funded by the state and federal governments. But none of these things are moving us fast enough towards the goal of having enough housing for people who are experiencing homelessness to move into. PATH's lease-up program is trying to address exactly this void. So there are these things called rapid rehousing vouchers, which are vouchers that provide a certain amount of money for a set fixed period of time for a person who's experiencing homelessness to be able to move into a home and to pay rent on that home for that period and transition out of that interim housing situation into something that is more permanent. Unfortunately, although we have funding for a lot of these vouchers, we don't have the landlords who want to take on those vouchers and to make sure that they're actually able to provide a home that can be connected to a voucher that can actually get someone off of the streets. PATH's lease-up program provides an incredible amount of support for landlords who are willing to take on vouchers and to take on individuals who are exiting homelessness, including case management support and other kinds of tools that can help a landlord make a very easy decision to accept a rapid rehousing voucher. And so our office is partnering with the lease-up program to call landlords, to tell them about the program, and to see whether they would be willing to participate, and to tell them about all the ways in which the lease-up program makes it easy for them to do that.
Thank you so much. I mean, you jumped right in on that, to really make sure that landlords in your district know about this valuable resource. And we appreciate you being here today. We appreciate your larger partnership and your larger leadership. I know we'll continue our work together. So thank you once again. Now I'm going to turn it over to Joel John Roberts, our CEO, to continue our conversation today.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, Councilmember Raman. We will now travel south a couple of hours, well, depending on traffic, to San Diego, where PATH has a large program there with nearly 150 staff members. And I'm really honored to introduce to you San Diego City Council Member Sean Elo-Rivera. And the council member represents San Diego's 9th district. If you're not from San Diego, it is east of Balboa Park. That's correct, right, Sean? East of Balboa Park. He covers City Heights, Mountain View, neighborhoods like that. The council member also is associated with the San Diego Leadership Alliance, La Raza Lawyers Association, Rise San Diego, and he's also a member of the Regional Task Force for the Homeless, which is a regional body that coordinates efforts to address homelessness in San Diego County. So welcome, Mr. Council Member.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Great. I've been following your campaign last year, and when you ran for your seat, you shared your personal story about why addressing housing instability and homelessness is so important to you. So I was just wondering if you could just share a little bit about your personal connection to that, housing instability and homelessness.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's important to me because I think human beings should have shelter. It's personal to me because of the experiences that I've had. The one that I most often speak about is my experience during law school, my first year here in San Diego, where in order to remove myself from an unhealthy relationship, I ended up spending, and I didn't have my family that could support paying for a hotel room or the cash reserves myself to do that. So I ended up spending a month living in my car during that first semester of law school. And obviously that was less than ideal. as I was trying to make it through school. But I did always, still feel fortunate to have the car, given that I was, literally driving by people who were without any shelter at all. But as I dove further into the issue of homelessness, I actually realized that my family had at various points in times when I was growing up experienced what would be defined as homelessness, right? So we were never on the street, but there were hotel rooms that we depended upon sometimes when we couldn't afford to stay in the home that we were renting. There was family members' living rooms and houses that we had to rely on as well. And so housing instability and housing and the technical definitions of homelessness are things that I've experienced. And then I guess beyond that, I would say seeing folks in my family struggle through addiction and mental illness at times has just really also provided me with an important reminder that it can be any of us who have those sort of struggles. And so there's a lot of personal connection when I see people who are dealing with those struggles as well.
I think it's so true. I know when people think of homelessness, they typically think of people on the streets in East Village in San Diego or in Skid Row in Los Angeles, and don't always think about people in our own families or people that we know. I think it's really great to have elected officials who've experienced the same difficulties that the people that they represent. Let's talk about rights. This country talks about the right to free speech, and freedom of religion, and even the right to have a gun and bear arms. But we don't talk about the right to a home, a house. So what do you think about that? And what does that mean to you?
Yeah, well, I think that we need to change that. Right? I think that I'd love to see that happen at the national level, but until we get there, I think we should be fighting for it at the local level. I think, when we talk about housing being a human right, to me, it's because it's something that everyone needs. And because it's something that everyone needs, it shouldn't be solely up to the private sector to provide it. It shouldn't be commoditized in the same sort of way that luxury items are. That isn't to say that there isn't a role for the private sector to play in housing, but I have a real issue with it being the only or almost the only way that we look to address housing needs. That's a huge problem. And so I think that affirmatively defining housing as a human right and then protecting it is absolutely something that we should do, and not because of the symbolism, but because of the impact that it'll have on people's lives, not just by saying it, but again, by enforcing that right as well.
So I'm going to put a little pressure on you.
Yeah.
As a council member, or if you were mayor or governor or even president, what does that mean? Does that mean we pay for everybody's rent? Does that mean we build a home for anyone who needs it? What do you think that means as an elected official? How would you practice that?
Yeah, so I think it takes a variety of different forms, right? And we need, I think an important part of the conversation that we're encouraging folks to think about when we talk about housing and homelessness is that there is no panacea. There's no single silver bullet that's going to solve any of these things, right? And so I want to name that part because I think it's important to be honest about that, and also recognize that in the housing and homelessness policy spaces, sometimes something being less than perfect becomes an excuse not to do it. And when nothing is perfect, that means we don't do anything. And that is completely unacceptable when it comes to an issue that is important as housing and homelessness. So I want to say that part first. But when I think about what the enforcement of housing as a right would look like, I'm not sure that it would mean, the government building houses for everyone. My guess is that not everyone would want that, right? So sometimes people go to the extreme version of what that might mean. I highly doubt that in American society, in the city of San Diego, everyone would want that. What I think at a minimum it means is ensuring that there's enough housing for everyone. I think it means that enforcing the protections that tenants and homeowners should have when, in terms of being forced out of their home. It means the government being willing to offer assistance to keep someone in their home when they are on the brink of not being able to maintain a roof over their head. And it also means making sure that housing is decent, right? Because it's not enough to simply have a roof over someone's head. Obviously, that's a bare minimum, but that housing should be decent as well. And so affirmatively enforcing those rights, or the protections of tenants, the habitability of homes, all of that to me is part of an ecosystem that would make for the realization of housing as a human right.
Let's talk a little bit about housing equity in your district. I know when most people think about housing inequity, they think of the big cities in America, LA, Chicago, New York. And when people think of San Diego, they think of SeaWorld and the zoo and going to Coronado, and it's a nice place to visit. They don't typically think about housing inequity. So just share a little bit about what are some of the ways people in your district experience housing inequity?
Yeah, well, the first thing I want to name is that San Diego, and I'm on a mission to have us accept and embrace this. We are a big city. We're the 8th biggest city in the country, right? My guess is that when the census is done here, 1.5 million people. So we're not LA, but we're not small, right? And so that small town mentality is a huge inhibitor to us, acting accordingly, to us having a government that is robust enough to provide for the community's needs and desires. So I want to say that part first. My district is San Diego's most diverse district. In one neighborhood of my district, City Heights, we have 45, upwards of 45 languages spoken, over 80 dialects, and somewhere in the range between 80,000 and 100,000 people in that neighborhood in my district. And the district is not just diverse in terms of culture and language or religion, it's diverse also in terms of socioeconomic status. So a 5-minute walk from my house north, and I am walking in a beautiful neighborhood, Kensington, with homes that are well over $1 million, and I am less than a 5-minute walk from a tent where people call home on a sidewalk next to El Cajon Boulevard, right? So there are huge inequities, and they are not spaced that far apart in terms of geography, and so the diversity of our district means housing inequity takes many different shapes and forms, right? So on the most extreme level, it means people being unhoused and people living on sidewalks and in canyons, and being subject to all the risks that take place when you are unsheltered. But it also means that we have a large undocumented population, and those folks, and I saw this when I was a legal intern, are often deprived of their rights in terms of habitability and in terms of tenant protections, because unscrupulous landlords and property management companies know that people who are undocumented, especially in the current environment that we are just now shifting from at the federal level, have a lot of fear in terms of speaking up and enforcing their rights. So it takes a lot of different shapes. And the last thing I want to name on this front in terms of San Diego is, sometimes our general numbers can be, not the worst, right? So, we don't have the worst homelessness crisis in the country, but we have a bad one. But we do have oftentimes huge disparities, right? And so, and I think homelessness that impacts Black San Diegans is a great example of that, a sad example of that. In a county where Black folks make up only 6% of the population, but 22% of the homeless population, that is a grotesque example of racial inequity when it comes to housing and homelessness.
You talk about disparity, and here in San Diego, we talk about the 8 freeway, and north of the 8 freeway is more well-off neighborhoods and people, and south is less well-off people of color. How do you think San Diego should respond to that?
Yeah, well, so I think, something that not just our office, but, more and more of the council members who are serving on San Diego City Council and the mayor, to his credit, are talking about is the need to really apply an equity lens and be equity minded in how we address policy in general and the budget. So it starts with intentionality, right? Of being committed to reducing disparities, and that commitment needs to start with an acknowledgement of what disparities exist and why, and having to be brutally honest with that, right? So we know that racism, overt, explicit, and sometimes implicit racism has caused a lot of the disparities that exist. We have to acknowledge that, and then once we acknowledge that, we can start to address it. And if we are intentional about it, I am very optimistic that we can eliminate those disparities over time, but only when we're willing to be honest about it. And until then, it will just continue to be the pervasive thing that it has been up until this point.
So you're in your first year of being council member in San Diego, and just what are your thoughts about new policies or programs that you would like to support or pursue when it comes to housing and homelessness in San Diego?
Yeah, so the first thing I want to do is acknowledge that, since the mayor took office and the new council has come in, I think there's already been some positive shifts. And, some of that work is happening in conjunction with PATH. I'm very, very glad to see that. It's a more humane and, quite frankly, smarter approach to dealing with the homelessness crisis. And I think that's all to be applauded. We have longer term policy goals for sure. But I think that in the immediate, one of the things that has been really important to me is to ensure that we are seizing the opportunity that is presented to us by way of some of the federal programs that have been put forward to address the crisis that exists as a result of COVID-19. So we've dedicated some of our time and efforts into seeing how the city could maximize the federal government's reimbursement program for a non-congregate shelter. I think that's super, super important, and we should be doing everything we can to utilize that funding. But I also want us to go bigger than that. I recently penned an op-ed where I said that this can be San Diego's moonshot moment when it comes to homelessness, and recognizing that that's a bit of a political cliche. I think it's an important symbol, because moonshots are these collective efforts, right, where we really look for partnerships, for unlikely coalitions in pursuit of a common goal. I don't think that there is any more noble common goal than making sure that everyone is housed and housed decently. And this moment we find ourselves in, where there are federal resources, where there is a commitment at the state, federal, and local levels to address this, seems like the perfect time to really go all in and aim big when it comes to homelessness. I don't want to hear about folks talking about reducing it or dealing with the problem of homelessness. We should be striving to end homelessness, and to do so in a way that is compassionate, which also happens to be the ways that are most effective.
I know you support and are part of the Regional Task Force for the Homeless, RTFH, and I'm actually on the board. So I have to just ask you, how do you see RTFH fit into the campaign to end homelessness in San Diego?
Yeah, well, I think the Regional Task Force, and while I'm no longer there, I was glad to be able to be there on the education seat when I was on the community college board. And I think it plays an important role of helping coordinate efforts, right? So I don't know if there's another issue that I can think of where there is a universal desire to see the problem solved, but less coordinated kind of society-wide action, given society's desire to see something change. And so the RTFH at its best can be a place where folks from different angles and with different types of expertise can come together to coordinate efforts, right? And so I think it can play an important role. I also think it's important that it provides concentrated and focused expertise. I've been glad to see that the mayor seems more committed to ensuring that the city has that capacity as well. It's not good enough to have this be a part of someone's portfolio. We need a whole team of folks who are solely focused on ending homelessness and providing for the needs of those who are unhoused.
Councilmember, thank you so much for participating in our program today. We really look forward to your leadership in San Diego, and it's just refreshing. I've been running PATH for 25 years now, and it's just refreshing to see new elected leaders come on board with different new perspectives and new ideas, and to provide new leadership. So we're grateful that you are part of steering San Diego into a new direction, and we're grateful that you're part of our program. We just want to thank Councilmember Raman from Los Angeles and Councilmember Elo-Rivera from San Diego for being part of this episode on housing equity and housing rights. And if you would like to support our efforts to move people into housing, you can support it through a program that we call Welcome Home, where you literally get you can literally get resources and help people move into their apartments. And there will be a link below, I believe there it is, that you can go to. We look forward to seeing you again in July for our next episode, focused on our outreach teams and the critical support they provide to our neighbors living on our streets. Thank you very much for being a part of the campaign to end homelessness through PATH, and to hear about special issues on homelessness. Thank you.